Thank you for tuning in to the final session from Africa to America, Africans in America, the transatlantic slave trade, and enslavement of Black bodies. So during this session, we will talk about the long nightmare, also known as the transatlantic slave trade, and the enslavement of Black bodies here in the Americas. This particular time period in history is one of the most downtrodden aspects of our story. The transatlantic slave trade was a brutal time period that was marked by forced transportation of millions of Africans to the Americas. Matter of fact, the transatlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history. We will never know how many of our ancestors were human trafficked into this country because we were treated as property. And in some cases, we were illegally smuggled into this country. Some historians estimate that there were 15 to 20 million Africans taken away from the continent to be brought into the Americas and exploited for slave labor, but we will never know. The Middle Passage, which is the part of the slave trade where our ancestors had to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which in some cases took months, and our people were subjected to overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, followed by systemic violence and erasure of our culture and our identity. Understanding this part of our history is more than crucial and critical because it has had a lasting impact on Black communities and our ongoing struggle for justice and equality in this country. So as we continue the journey of learning our history, we also have to continue the process of unlearning to relearn. And that takes place as we continue to reframe historical narratives. And one of those narratives is that the first documented case of enslaved Africans to arrive in what we know as North America was in 1619. This is partially true, but history is much more complex and has many nuances that are usually not discussed within traditional classrooms and textbooks. What we see is in 1526, the earliest documented arrival of enslaved Africans in North America took place at a Spanish colony off the coast of the Carolinas known as San Miguel de Guape. Here, our people were subjected to bondage alongside indigenous people or Native Americans. What happened here that was unique and different from other narratives is that these groups came together, conspired, and revolted against the Spanish successfully, and they escaped. These Africans integrated into the community of local Native Americans, then the rest of that story remains a mystery within history. 1619 was a significant turning point as it marked the introduction of the transatlantic slave trade into the British North American colonies. And it solidified the status of Black folks as a long term condition and slavery as a long term institution. It was a process that was gradual, but in 1640, John Punch, a Black indentured servant, fled with two white counterparts, which resulted of John Punch being sentenced to a lifetime of enslavement, not the two white counterparts. It was in 1662 that the Virginia colony enacted and stated a law that basically said that the status of Black children will be determined by the condition of their mother. So if their mother was in a state or in a condition of enslavement, the child would enter the world already within the condition of bondage of an enslavement. It was also in 1705, the Virginia Slave Code defined imported servants who are not Christian in their native country as enslaved people or slaves. Furthermore, all Negro, mulatto, and Indian enslaved people within the colony were deemed real estate or property. In 1770, a few years before the colonists declared independence from the British, the enslaved African population in British North America had reached almost a half a million people. Our traditional textbooks usually tries to minimize the impact of the slave trade. But this illustration right here shows the large scale of how Africans were forcibly removed from the African continent and trafficked into the Americas. The African diaspora, which is a movement or scattering of African people from the African continent, and the biggest impetus that created the African diaspora would be the slave trade. And as you look at this illustration here, you see all throughout the slave trade that only maybe zero point 0.5 million Africans were brought to what we know as North America. The vast majority of our ancestors and our people were actually brought to South America, which you see 5 million, in the Caribbean, or what was known as the West Indians during that time period, of 4.5 million, and other parts of South and Central America, and even also the European continent. Middle Passage was just one of the many stages of this dehumanizing process that we endured, our ancestors endured. Middle Passage itself represents a very brutal phase of the transatlantic slave trade, during which millions of our African ancestors were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, enduring extreme hardships and dehumanizing conditions that most of us can never imagine. Our ancestors had experienced overcrowded and unsanitary conditions aboard slave ships with little regard to their well being or their essential humanity. During this journey, many of our people died from diseases, malnutrition, and as enslaved people were treated like commodities, or rather human beings. It had such a physical, mental, and spiritual toll on our people, and the implications of this is still with us today. So, following the American Revolution, the United States of America formally comes into existence. In the 1787 Constitutional Convention, when our so-called forefathers drafted our U.S. Constitution, there were 55 delegates, and 25 of them were slaveholders. None of the delegates could defend slavery on moral reasoning or grounds, but instead they defended it on economic interests because slavery and the free labor provided by our ancestors provided a economic foundation for this country. Prominent figures like Thomas Jefferson called it a hideous blot on our nation's history, even though he owned enslaved people. The term slave does not appear in the original Constitution. It is addressed but not eliminated initially. In Article 1, Section 2, known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, enslaved people were counted as three-fifths of the white inhabitants of that particular state for representation in Congress. And it is also Article 1, Section 9 that restricts Congress from prohibiting the importation of slaves until 1808. After 1808, you can no longer import Africans directly from the continent. Slavery continued to exist up until 1865. Article 4, Section 2 included what we know as a fugitive slave clause. And if enslaved individuals escape, they can be returned back to their owners. Our initial 15 presidents of the United States, 10 of them were slaveholders, including George Washington. So here's one of the first census records taken in American history. In 1790, we have a total population of almost 4 million people. Out of the total population, we have 59,000 free blacks, but we have 694,207 enslaved individuals that we know of. And the vast majority of those existed in the South. Even though slavery was a hideous blot, it was economically feasible. By 1776, we knew that labor intensive crops such as rice, tobacco, and sugarcane were the foundation, the economic foundation of this country. And it was before the Civil War that cotton constituted 50% of our nation's exports, with the South producing 60% of the world's cotton. And all of this relied on the free labor of African people. The North, along with certain European nations, Western European nations, directly profited from the slave trade. They took the raw materials such as cotton and they manufactured it to finished goods at textile factories. They provided insurance against enslaved people just in case they died or ran away. They were also the ones who invested in transporting our ancestors across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. And they also provided loans with interest to help slave owners purchase Africans. There were professions like shipbuilders, sailors, carpenters, blacksmiths, and painters who were directly employed by the slave trade. Tariffs and duties that were collected from the sale of Africans also helped finance public works such as roads, streets, and schools in northern cities. The life of the enslaved was dehumanizing. Their work was very labor intensive. And the average enslaved person typically started their day before sunrise and they engaged in labor intensive tasks of picking cotton, cutting sugarcane until the sun went down. And some of those days averaged between 12 to 14 hours a day, possibly. Their days were filled with strenuous work. They worked in the fields, tended to livestock, in some cases performed domestic chores. Their lives were always under constant surveillance, and their mobility was extremely and almost completely limited. They had almost no autonomy, right? They were denied education, their basic rights were denied, they were considered property, and they could make no independent decisions. And if they resisted, they had to live under the constant threat of violence and punishment, which contributed to their fear and oppression and repression. At any point, families could be separated and sold to other owners. So they dealt with the anxiety of losing their children, their wives, and husbands. The harsh reality of an enslaved person meant that basic rights that should be endowed to all human beings were completely denied to them, which led to a very much dehumanizing existence. Black people have to be some of the most resilient people on this planet. Our ancestors did not acquiesce to enslavement. We resisted enslavement. One of the core aspects or components of our history should be resistance. Enslaved Africans often engage in acts of resistance. If it was as simple as slowing down, pretending to be sick, or making mistakes to undermine productivity, or just maintaining our culture and our spirit and some aspects of our African identity. Some enslaved people resorted to violent acts, attempted to run away or escape, form autonomous communities in the wilderness known as maroons, and they would risk severe consequences if they were caught or captured. There were numerous violent uprisings that took place in the Americas. Here in North America, we have more than 215 documented cases of violent rebellions. One of the most successful rebellions that took place in North America was led by a brother known as Nat Turner. And what he did is demonstrated enslaved people's determination to fight against oppression and dehumanization and seeking freedom by any means necessary. To wrap up, here's a few things to discuss. How did the institution of slavery shape and contribute to the economic foundation of the United States of America and other nations involved? How did our African ancestors resist the institution of slavery? What are some examples? And discuss the various forms of resistance. Throughout this journey of unlearning and relearning and reframing our narratives, I hope that we got something that was invaluable and beneficial for us to pass down to our younger generations and instill pride and agency in our children about who we are. Thank you for tuning in. God bless.